Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for what is the third event in our series, our Career Chat series for the JSPG Ambassador Program. Today, we are joined by André Porter, who is JSPG's Director of Communications and Public Affairs, has been with the journal for quite some time, and outside of his role at JSPG, currently serves as a Senior Program Officer at the National Academies. I'm really interested to sort of learn more, Andre, about your career path and share your insights about a science policy career with this ambassador cohort. So thank you again for being here.
Absolutely.
So we have some general questions prepared, and then can turn to audience Q&A if there is any. But I wanted to sort of start out and get your general overview of what drew you towards a career in science policy. How did you get to where you are today?
Sure. So I got into science policy in kind of a roundabout kind of fashion. I mean, I got into science in general because I wanted to impact, the scientific enterprise. That's why I went to college and got a degree in biology and then did graduate research on biology. That was kind of my intent. It wasn't necessarily, there was no endpoint, like a specific endpoint. Like I didn't want to cure a specific type of cancer or come up with a specific theory. It was, I want to impact science for the better.
Right.
And when I realized that I didn't want to become a professor, then I started kind of evaluating how else could I impact science. And it was through, because I've been working for so long, it was through an internship at not an internship, it was through a job I had at the National Science Foundation, working in the Division of Graduate Education, and I kind of ran into someone who was the senior policy advisor for that directorate, and he kind of contextualized kind of how policies impacted science. So I had already, for a very long time, before I got into the National Science Foundation, I worked at the EPA for almost 7 years. And so I had worked on programs that were impacting science, but I did not know of science policy as like a career pathway. It was kind of just like, this is the job. You're
Right.
writing solicitations, or you are writing kind of synthesis documents, which are at the EPA at least, or when at the EPA, when I was at the EPA, was kind of codifying and contextualizing all of the research that had been funded up to that point, figuring out where the gaps were, and then developing new solicitations and programs around the gaps. And so I had been working in science policy in all these different facets, but it wasn't until I went to the National Science Foundation and had some like one-on-one conversations with some of the folks over there that you can actually, that could be your title, policy advisor could be your title. And really what you're working on is those kind of the intricacies in between the program and the science that help facilitate that science. And so it was like, oh, so I don't need to get a PhD. Well, you can get a PhD, and I think it's important if you want to pursue a PhD. But if I wanted to impact science, there's another pathway. Like I don't need to be at the bench. I could be working in the federal government, working in nonprofits, et cetera. All the places that science policy exists, which is throughout, it exists across the gamut. But it was like, oh, okay, so there is the, sit at the bench and impact your niche of science, which I was able to do, and able to get my research published back when I was working on it. So I was able to do that, but then there was this kind of broader impact that you could have working on science policy, which became very attractive. So it was like, okay, well, my master's research was on fish mating behaviors. Oh, I made this, I evaluated negative frequency dependent mate selection. Ooh, this is great. I liked it, but like also very, very niche. And if you don't care about guppies and mate preferences, you're likely not gonna read my paper. But at the EPA, I was able to like impact policies that affected broadening participation for undergrad and graduate researchers. I was able to work on policies that impacted, ecological risk assessment and toxicology grants and water infrastructure and water quality, things that I would not have been able to do within my research because it was very zeroed in on behavioral genetics. But it was like, oh, if I work in the government, or if I work in these kind of organizations and work in these specific positions, I could impact a much broader set of science, and I can impact more disciplines, and I can impact more people. And so that it was, I hate to, I don't want to say it was like a narcissistic, I can have this huge impact on science, but it was more like my goal has always been to help drive science forward.
Mhm.
So once I found out there was multiple ways to do that, it was like, oh, I think this way kind of fits who I am and kind of where I want to be. Because I know I don't want to be a professor. I did the TA thing. It was great. And I'm glad I was able to help a lot of students get through their undergraduate careers in genetics and biology. But to do that for 30 years was not something I was interested in. But I still want to impact science. So it was like, okay, well, I can do it this way. And that's kind of that was the kickoff. Like I had been working at that point when I found out that you could have like policy and science policy as like the main drivers of your job title. I had already been working in science policy for maybe like 8 years at that point. So it was like,
Right.
oh, let me do some retrospective review of what I've been doing. Oh, okay. Let me recontextualize this, which I thought was kind of administrative work or just basic government work. And you learn very quickly that science policy is integrated within the federal government, like everywhere is integrated within, whether it's in the executive branch or the judicial branch. I mean, judicial people don't think a lot about it, but like there are many court decisions that have impacted science for better and worse. And then also, in the legislative branch, working on advocacy and working on things like drafting bills and addressing bill drafts and things of that nature. But you don't do it in the federal government because that's, I think, illegal. But you do it in advocacy, and I was able to do a lot of that outside of it. So it was a recognition that I didn't want to sit at the bench or sit at the podium, so to speak,
Mhm.
but that there was a wide open field for how I can get into how I can advance science, and that was really through policy, and that just manifests in so many diverse ways that it became more attractive, so to speak, to me. But like
Right.
when I was at the EPA, I had worked in enough grant programs to know like, oh, this wasn't for me, and I had taught enough to know that this isn't for me.
Mhm.
Um, love science, I actually do love bench work. And I love working on research, and I love coming up with new ideas, and I love kind of testing. I mean, I'm a nerd through and through. But to do it every day until I retire was like, I don't know if this is what I want to do. So that's kind of how I got it. It was kind of a roundabout re-evaluation of where I've been and kind of
Right.
people have had science policy in their titles, I guess, for not a long time, maybe the last 15, 20 years, or maybe even longer than that, because there are plenty of reports. But it wasn't apparent to me until like 8 years into my career that,
Mhm.
it shifted that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the environment now is like it is sort of right for people to pursue these sorts of opportunities.
Yeah.
Um, Sort of on and along sort of similar lines. So, there are all these potential opportunities to sort of get involved in this space. And there's within science policy, there's like, a billion different sort of policy issues that you could potentially focus on. What would your advice be to someone who's starting out? How do you sort of find within the science policy community your sort of niche and what sort of work environment is best for you?
Sure, that's a great question. I think there are resources abound that people just don't know exist. I think the knee-jerk reaction is kind of the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which is a great opportunity for many folks, but there's a specific group of folks that they look for, and you have a PhD, been working, maybe not been working, but it's a very specific set of
Right.
things. So when I talk to students, grad students, undergrad, like you can go into undergrad or come out of undergrad and go into a career in science policy. It's possible. I think it is the less credentials you have, because the PhD kind of creates I don't want to say a fast track, but like a natural kind of pathway towards science policy. The less credentialing you have, the more creative you have to be.
Mhm.
And how you get to science policy, unfortunately, most of the opportunities don't exist for people without PhDs.
Right.
Most of the fellowships require PhDs. Most of even some of the jobs require PhDs, I would say, I mean, I always say that I got into science policy in a roundabout fashion, and I think it was helpful for me because it provided a different set of or a different way of training for science policy than I think most of the folks who do the natural AAAS, STPF, or FASIB policy fellowship, or kind of those tried and true areas. Um, it provided a different kind of way. So I would say as a suite of resources, if you're in the middle of the country, many state legislatures have fellowship programs.
Mm-hmm.
They may not be a fellowship program on public health, or they generally, and then generally, in my kind of review of what exists kind of in the middle of the country as it relates to fellowship programs and kind of ways to get into the legislature and start working on policy, they're broader, partly because those legislatures tend to be citizen legislatures, which means that, like, the guy who has the ice cream truck, this is a weird example, but the guy at the ice cream truck is also the state legislator, and he needs support. He's the ice cream truck owner, but he doesn't know anything about public health, right? So there are many states that have kind of transient fellowship opportunities where they bring undergrads and grad students to the state capitol for the summer to kind of work on these legislative opportunities. So I would recommend that folks look for those kind of internships, barring any advisor issues. I know some advisors are not, very intense on their students doing, training outside of their what they're overusing them for. So I would say look at your state legislature. Especially if you exist in the Midwest, there are many opportunities, especially for undergrads out there, for getting incorporated. And I would also say that go to your disciplines association, especially a larger one. They tend to, and I used to do this when I was at an association, they tend to create these opportunities for students, like Hill Days and writing campaigns when legislation comes out, which are like the tried and true things of advocacy. You go to the Hill, you develop a writing campaign, and you get folks to participate and write their legislator about a specific piece of legislation. They seem kind of innocuous and kind of like, why would I do this? This just seems haphazard. But what you don't recognize, and what you should recognize, that you are, when you are at a lack of resources, I think it's best to try to be as nimble and creative on how you kind of leverage your opportunities. And those opportunities that many of the societies who are clamoring for their membership to get involved in some of those advocacy things are looking for people who are intent on doing that. And if you're interested in science policy, you're an undergrad, grad student, postdoc, these are kind of easy, generally don't require applications. It's like, oh, you are a grad student. That's kind of your qualification, your position. You're a grad student in a specific discipline, you can write. And so you participate in this writing campaign. That writing and that advocacy is science policy. It is helping drive policy for the advancement of science, or helping address some scientific impact on a particular piece of policy. And I would say always look for those resources, always look for those opportunities, because they provide a resume builder, not a resume pattern. So you can look to be like, as you are collecting these experiences, that you're adding them to your resume. Oh, I'm interested in science policy, so let me do more around advocacy and legislation, or addressing legislation. A resource that people rarely, if ever, use is that the Federal Register, which, if you're not familiar and you're interested in science policy, is kind of one of the toolkits that folks in science policy, especially in the advocacy space, use. It is the clearinghouse for all federal actions. So if there's a new policy that's being proposed by the federal government, it's going to come up in the Federal Register. They generally have 30 to 60-day comment periods, and that's an opportunity for you to, work on your writing, work on your ability to kind of coalesce information into a critique of policy. I did a lot of policy critique when I was working in the scientific society. I did it as my job, but anybody, grad student, undergrad, postdoc, regular citizen, could could submit comments to policy changes. And it's kind of a opportunity to get those experiences under your feet. And then when you're applying for jobs in science policy, you can be like, I've done this Hill Day, I've worked on this legislation, I've responded and or worked with my a student-led group on science policy to respond to certain federal actions. And that is a way to kind of get around not having experience or not having a PhD or not having all these things to kind of advance your background in science policy. That would be the other thing that, you know, I always recommend. If your school doesn't have a science policy club or group, look to do that. Look to create one. It's an opportunity for you to express or show your skills in organizing, to again addressing and coalescing ideas around different policy topics. They're just these little kind of ways of getting that experience and those skill sets without, you know, actually having a job or actually cutting out your education. Like you can do all of these things in the background of doing your research or doing your classes, etc. Generally low activation energy. I mentioned before, most societies are like clamoring for their membership to get involved. And generally, I think, well, depending on the society, younger people are more interested in getting involved, which is great.
Right.
But also that creates eventually those younger people are going to graduate and then they won't be as involved. So it's an opportunity to kind of leverage that perspective. I don't think there's any other reasons. Yeah, I would look to the state legislatures. They generally have some internships and fellowship opportunities that are more broad. So you might end up working on transportation research or transportation policies, and you are a biology undergrad, which you may think has no connection, but there are connections that you can make. Look for opportunities within your societies as well as your different scientific STEM affinity groups to participate in advocacy, Hill Days, letter writing campaigns. If you don't have this, or if you don't have this, develop a science policy group at your institution, or join that science policy group. And also look to the Federal Register and different federal actions to begin developing both the skills and the track record for how you address and look at policies and critique policies for the advancement of your different disciplinary areas. And I think as you coalesce all those resources together, you will eventually find out that you are building a skill set that you can add to your resume that will help you be very marketable when it's time to, you know, look for that science policy job.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I think even what may seem like the sort of smallest action can not only sort of help you build skills, but it also brings you into contact with like-minded people who also want to get into this space. And you know, the science policy community is large, but also I feel like very close knit in a lot of ways. You run into the same people.
The spheres overlap. There are a lot of people who I had seen and now I work with, or who had seen me and I have no idea they even knew who I was. And it was like, how do you know who I am? And it's like, what are you talking about? No, that's very true. It's broad, it's huge, partly because I think people don't have a good recognition of how integrated science policy is in almost everything.
Right.
So that speaks to the broadness of it. So some people may not not even notice that they're doing science policy, which is great. But also depending on the area. So if you're in higher education, policies that impact higher education, those spheres start to kind of coalesce and butt up against each other. Higher education area is everybody eventually meets everybody at some point. Or even if you're doing biomedical research, those folks ultimately interface with each other. Once you get kind of more granular into whatever area of science policy that you're focusing on, you will end up eventually meeting all of the players or most of the players in that space, which I think is there's benefits there. It's also, I think, a recognition that folks need to move on and allow new people to come in, but that is the society that we exist.
So it is. Yeah. Well, I want to be cognizant of your time. So I want to, you know, thank you again for doing this. I also want to put in a plug, you know, for JSPG and, you know, the journal. Our goal through the ambassador program and through all the other sort of activities that we do is to sort of help cultivate those skill sets among the next generation of scientists. So I encourage everyone to sort of even as you move beyond the ambassador program to sort of think about other ways to engage with the journal, because that also is a great, policy writing opportunity, among other things. But yeah, thank you again for doing this. And to those who are watching this recording, I appreciate you taking the time to listen in, and hope that this has been as insightful conversation to you as it has been to me. So thanks again.
No problem. Thank you.